Welcome to the Balancing Act podcast. I'm Andy Temte, and today we've got the founder of Palmer Media, the host of Trending in Education, and best of all, my former Kaplan colleague, Mike Palmer, on the show. Welcome, Mike.
It's great to be here, Andy. Very great to see you.
Well, it's great to be seen these days. We'll take that as a win. So today we're going to continue our conversation about the Reskilling Revolution. In the last show, Dan Strafford and I talked about what the Reskilling Revolution is, what it's not, a little bit about skills versus degrees as signals of workplace competency. But we've got this industry expert, Mike Palmer, on the show, so we're going to dive a little bit deeper. But before we get started, Mike, it'd be great if you told our listeners your story.
Sure. Yeah. So I was born back in the 20th century, believe it or not, Andy, despite my youthful vigor, and started my career in the early 90s, originally in psychology. My dad was a psychologist, worked in child and adolescent psych. Realized that probably wasn't the best path for me, in part because of you have to be in a good head, I think, to be able to lean into a career of dealing with mental illness. And, I had some of that in my family as well. So decided to pursue my other passion, which was education. And that's how I started teaching for Kaplan test prep way back in the day. I always scored well on those tests, was able to get a tuition, full tuition at New College of Florida based in part on my test scores. So I was a big believer in some of the more positive aspects of test prep, although I still struggle with some of the equity issues there. But I had a great run, 20 years at Kaplan, starting as a teacher, wound up an instructional designer, got in on e-learning in the early 2000s and kind of never looked back. At Kaplan, we helped launch their live online program, which really grew over the course of the years. One of the things that I also launched was a podcast called Trending in Education. That was like an R&D project for me when I was heading up a lot of the new media innovation at Kaplan, mainly for Kaplan Test Prep, and then across all of Kaplan and Graham Holdings, because Graham Holdings also had Slate, and I believe at the time may have had Gimlet when at least we started, but there's certainly interest there in, the formerly Washington Post company is very much a media company, and podcasting is a big part of their portfolio. So it just seemed like the right thing to do while I was at Kaplan to lean into that. Launched Trending in Ed back in 2016. Have done coming up on 450 episodes since then, and I think over 200 episodes now since I left Kaplan in 2019. Left just before the pandemic to start my consultancy. Was able to hold on to the podcast along the way. So, trendingined.com if you're interested. Trending in Education, coming out about twice a week these days. A lot of interviews, conversations about where the world of learning is going. And I use that as a way to get my brand out there, to get other consulting work and, help folks work on their messaging, work on their communication skills, some media training, produce podcasts, live streams. Basically, hit me up. I may be able to help you, but yeah, it's been a crazy time to get out on my own. Also, me and my wife, we had our son back in December of 2018, so it's also been a journey of early parenthood, concurrent with the pandemic and the social awakenings that have happened and all the challenges we've been facing. So yeah, it's been a heck of a ride, and I'm kind of leaning into what I hope is more of an actual new normal, although I'll believe it when I see it, coming out of the crazy couple of years that we've all been, managing of late.
Yeah. So Yeah, absolutely. On trending in education, 450 episodes you're dropping like as we're speaking here. So congratulations on that. I think you're on the Balancing Act podcast. You'll be episode 32. So we're creating the portfolio, but we're way behind you. Who's like the most interesting guest you ever had on Trending in Education?
Well, and, as a parent, I love all my children equally, and I love all my guests and all my episodes equally. Andy Tempty was really remarkable, and folks should track down Andy's episodes on Trending in Ed. It's also fun, honestly, to have folks who are on over a span of time, which you were, just to see how conversations evolve. That's one of the things I really love about it. My favorite guest, my favorite experience was when we had Wendy Zuckerman from Science Versus in a live panel at the Javits Center as part of the NAB, National Association of Broadcasters, New York event, which was pretty wild. And Wendy's amazing. She's a Australian science reporter who now does this really wonderful, entertaining take on science, and frequently debunks a lot of the bad information that's out there. So, and she's hilarious while she does it. So that was just in terms of that experience, that was great. I also was a big fan of our Annie Duke episode, who wrote Thinking in Bets, former poker player who crossed over into more management consulting and is now working on decision information and teaching people how to be better at decision making. I thought that was great. And then the last piece that's probably a little more relevant, or as I like to say, germane. That's germane to this conversation. Germane is an
awesome word.
It's a good word, and he was also a nice member of the Jackson Five. But germane to this conversation is Micheal Weiss's book. I had Micheal on last year. She wrote a book called Long Life Learning, and it was really interesting. Talked a lot about the revolution around skills and reskilling and how to think about the future of work and our professional lives, and reminding us that the combination of us living longer and the level to which the workplace is going to be disrupted by the emergence of new skills. Your educational journey can't just be 4 years from 18 to 22 and then you hunker down and don't learn anything again for the rest of your life. So I thought Micheal is probably most in line with the skills revolution that you're talking about. But that's something I've been gravitating towards recently with a lot of the more visionary folks, the people who are thinking about the future of work and what's emerging. You do start to see what's nice about a podcast like Trending in Ed is that I'm intentionally broad. I try to get as wide a cross section, and it's interesting when certain things bubble up across sectors and across industries. And I would say the focus on lifelong learning, reskilling, learning as a benefit, and a skills-based orientation towards all of that is something that I've been hearing much, much more of late.
Yeah. Well, that's your place here in our guest list for our Reskilling Revolution series is very purposeful because of the broad experience that you bring to the table. 450 episodes of talking to folks about these concepts. So let's dive into the Reskilling Revolution.
Yeah.
World Economic Forum estimates that up to 1 billion people will need to be reskilled, not just upskilled, but reskilled due to job disruption over the next decade. And as you think back on those hundreds of conversations that you've had with learning leaders, is the reskilling revolution real? Is it hype? Is it a combination of both? Dan Strafford and I, in the previous episode, we took out the shiny ball and we asked ourselves, is this a shiny ball moment or is this real? So what's your take?
Well, it's probably a little both and, the postmodernist in me doesn't like either ors, and even I was talking to somebody recently about quantum computing rather than, binary computing. So the idea that there are more ranges and nuance to conversations is typically where the reality is. And at the end of the day, a shiny ball is still a shiny ball. You kind of want to play with the shiny ball, I would think. But I would say, one of the concepts that we talk about a ton is the Gartner hype cycle, which I'm a big fan of. It's a little pseudoscience. There's a lot of research that goes into it, but they turn it into a chart, which is a little bit gimmicky. But it basically, the idea is that new ideas, when they first come out there, go through a hype cycle. Frequently, there's a lot of more investment, a lot more R&D around that space until it reaches what they call a peak of inflated expectations, before falling into a trough of disillusionment, and then ultimately a plateau of productivity. So it's very evocative language here that Gartner has given us. But
they stole the change management curve from all the change management folks.
Yeah, and I couldn't tell whether it was the change management curve. Also, it looks a little bit like an action potential. If you look at how a neural impulse moves around. But regardless, they're consultants. It's all about packaging these days. But yeah, they talk about how a lot of new stuff becomes sexy and then becomes less so after people talk about it for a while. And I think some of that is probably true. I'd say that's particularly true when you talk about, almost like the skill of the day, the idea that this new and emergent skill you absolutely have to learn, the blockchain, which is probably a good example because the blockchain, I'm a big believer in its long-term relevance, and it's a space that people should at least understand the basic architecture of it. Does that mean they should become Bitcoin traders and getting into NFTs and doing all these other things? Probably not. That's where things get a little frothy and the hype starts to maybe steer you in the wrong directions. More broadly, it's real that the rate at which skills are the shelf life of skills is becoming much, much shorter. People, regardless of their primary focus in their careers, are going to need to upskill, reskill, outskill on digital profiles and capabilities that they probably never had earlier in their careers. And that's just to keep up. That's not even to get ahead of things. There's a quote that I like from Bill Taylor, which is, are you learning as fast as the world is changing? And that, for me, I was a believer in that quote 15, 20 years ago when the world was changing at a much, much slower rate. Now that rate is accelerating. It is like, for those of you like calculus, it's like a second derivative. We're actually accelerating into the future at rates we have not seen before. The level of disruption we've seen, driven in particular by the pandemic, is also unprecedented, and it directly impacted education in a lot of fundamental ways. So, I don't think we put the genie back in the bottle in terms of the need for upskilling, reskilling, adapting, being flexible and dynamic in terms of responding to what's emerging. But I'm not sure anyone's really solved it now. And I think as a country, I'd say the U.S. is woefully behind where we should be in terms of responding to something we've seen on the horizon for I'd say, at least the last 10 years. And, that's why the revolution may not have been televised. It may have already happened. And now it's more a question of how do we retool and get out ahead of it. And I think there's a lot of work to be done on that front.
Yeah, this kind of fear of the future that is brewing in a very polarized and public fashion. We're not going to get into politics, but there definitely is this faction that wants to go backwards in time and go back to a simpler time. The concept of being a lifelong learner, You brought up Michelle Weiss's book before. Lifelong learning is the elixir. It is the cure for a lot that ails us right now. And if we continue to focus on education, broadening our minds, mental agility, growth mindset, however you phrase it, that almost forces you into a position of saying, okay, the path is forward and together, and it's not going back, because the old days of getting a college degree and going through 4 or 5 years and saying, oh, okay, the learning is done. Now I get to take a deep breath and skate for the rest of my life and just work. That world doesn't exist. So I'm curious, in all those conversations that you've had, drill down one level deeper. What are some of the most important future skills our listeners should be thinking about acquiring?
Yeah, I really like the cut of skills based on those that are durable, which is the new terminology that I've been using more for what had been called soft skills or social emotional skills, but skills that easily translate. And there's the concept of learning transfer, where if you have these skills in one domain, it's relatively easy to translate them into another. The example I like to use around durable skills is storytelling, where like if you're good at telling stories, if you're good at empathy and collaboration, those are the types of skills that will translate into the new formats that emerge. The way in which you deliver a podcast is probably going to change, but regardless of how you're delivering it, and whether it's a podcast or a webinar or a live stream or a blog post, however you're getting your information out there, however you're communicating to the world around you, at the end of the day, good narrative, a clear message, good communication skills, empathy, the right level of emotionality so that your humanity comes across. Those are the things that will outlast the robo-revolution that we're also in the midst of. There will be increased automation, and if an organization doesn't have an AI strategy right now, they probably need to put something on paper just to say, this is how we're thinking about our human capital. This is where we have a position on where the human will have a unique role in our organization in the future. And then the flip side of that is also true. Where could things that are currently done by humans scale better and differently if they're powered by technology? Like, that's a real context. That is happening nowadays. And that's why, in some ways, tripling down on the more uniquely components of your skill set is really critical, but it's another both end, because on the other side, you still need harder, more technical skills to allow you to snap into the digital ecosystem that is emerging. And that's also where I would encourage, particularly, I guess I'm Gen X, even though I don't like to take on the labels, but I would say, especially folks Gen X up, Gen X and Boomers and beyond, don't have a fixed mindset about digital capabilities and about your ability to learn things. Those are old tropes that in many ways have been debunked. So I would say, on the one hand, as you get further on in your career, I would say the more durable skills should be better, hopefully. Like, you're better at collaborating, you understand what leadership is, maybe you have some management experience, you have quote unquote EQ, and you can lead folks. But don't shirk the responsibility that we all have to also stay flexible and current in terms of the skills that you deploy on a day-to-day basis. My dad, well into his 70s, into his early 80s, was still doing a blog and was still leaning into some of these new capabilities. And that is the normal. And I think there's a lot of waste in our collective system because we're not tapping into the continued growth potential within each human really throughout the full range of their lives. So I'd say, try to stay inspired, embrace the truly human competencies that are a real differentiator, and then, eat your vegetables a little bit, like do your homework around some of these emerging skills. You might be surprised too, because, a lot of the stuff's becoming more code free, like a lot of it is more, you just get used to an interface, play around with it a little bit. It's kind of designed, the interfaces are getting better. It's becoming easier to power your digital tool set. So yeah, I'd say don't give up hope. Continue to lean in.
Yeah, it's one. Well, you're really referring to logic as a skill in terms of being able to navigate interfaces where the code has been taken out, but to navigate all that, you still need a foundation of maybe not mathematical logic, but I think that everybody should have some sort of course in how A leads to B, B leads to C, and logical consistency. That's one of those key foundational skills. The big question, one of the big questions that Dan and I talked about in the previous show was, what is the role of higher education here? Skills are changing so fast, and we know that higher education institutions generally are extraordinarily lethargic. Do they have a place in the reskilling revolution in your opinion, and how do they keep up?
Yeah, I think they have a place. It's just not as big a place perhaps as they believe it to be. I think a lot of our more established institutions of higher learning suffer from what I would characterize as the smartest guy in the room problem, where they're used to having some sense of status, and with that status comes some elitism that at times is not actually grounded in solving real work-life problems. And that disconnect is presenting some real challenges to higher ed. I think there's still a role to be played there. I don't see higher ed going away by any stretch, but there is an opportunity for an emerging marketplace around pathways that aren't as much tied to the traditional 4-year undergraduate degree, the credit hour. And that's where, I recently had Ryan Craig on Trending in Ed. He's really interesting, does a newsletter called Gap Letter. He's one of the leaders of Achieve Partners, which is a fund that is looking at, one of the things that it's looking at is alternatives to traditional pathways to your first good job, which don't necessarily involve a traditional higher ed pathway, which basically translates into paid internships for more quote unquote regular jobs with, non-skilled trades. Like if you want to get a job with HubSpot, you might get an internship straight out of high school. You would be paid $45,000 a year and be equipped with skills for HubSpot, which would include the foundational logic, the business acumen. You'd be trained with an end game in mind, and you'd be trained by doing real work that is relevant to the organization that's hiring you. That to me is really interesting, and it does start to solve some of the problem. Higher ed also, I think, has a problem, at the bottom. A lot of folks who really are not going to make it through these monolithic credentialing exercises wind up in a worse position than they were when they began. And that can really have a negative knock-on effect throughout their life, because they were trying to do something positive with their lives that was powered by education. I think we all believe in the promise there. I would say get your bachelor's degree if you can. It's a great tool in terms of your long-term career prospects and wellness on multiple fronts, but it's not right for everyone. And there's a lot of selection criteria and biases built into the model of higher ed that I do think is damaging. And that's where I think the more disruptive, skills-based, on-the-job training, paid internships, that space, and a lot of the thinkers I'm gravitating to lately are talking more about this type of stuff. That's where I see higher ed playing a role. And I think the role frequently will come from those universities and community colleges that are connected into the local community, including the Chamber of Commerce and the local industry leaders. And if fishing is big, then the university tailors itself to that job market and, has some deeper roots built into the local community. So I think there is a real future for more community-based education right on through higher ed that is a little more integrated, hopefully more connected to K-12 on the one hand, and then in particular in job placement on the other. But I don't think higher ed is out ahead, and I don't think they're necessarily in a leadership position. And a lot of your more established institutions, I think, have trouble with those types of dynamics.
Yeah, I like what you're, if I'm the leader of a higher education institution, get connected back into the business community. I think there's been a real, look, there's been some great work that's happened in terms of connecting business with academic institution, but there's also many academic leaders that don't get involved in their local in the local community and the employers that surround them. So that's wonderful advice. Mike, as we get close to the end of our time together here, I want to get back to podcasting. Yeah. Because you when you talked about skills, you talked about storytelling. I've written a lot about storytelling and the importance of finding your voice. And this process of having what we're doing right now, having conversations, structured conversations. It's a tremendous skill. So what's one piece of advice you'd give to someone who's thinking about getting into the podcasting game?
Yeah, I would say do it for the love of the game to a certain extent, and do it for the conversations and the relationship building that happens. I wouldn't recommend doing it to make money. It's a pretty difficult pathway. But if you are trying to hone your game, the way in which I have a conversation now, 450 or so of these in, versus the way I thought about a conversation when I started, is worlds different. And there are 350 people in the world now who I've co-created something meaningful with. And there's a level of connection and intimacy that you get there that is really unparalleled, So you learn how to speak in your own voice, and you build relationships and a body of work that you're going to value for the rest of your life. And especially if you don't think you're going to make money doing it, I would say jump in.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, that's what we've done here. You had a 20 plus year career at Kaplan. I had a 20 plus year career at Kaplan. I have nothing but good things to say about that experience. But now we're off doing something else, and I just love this platform as a way to get the word out and find my voice in a different way, and then hopefully we grow an audience and make some connections. And if we're super lucky, we make some money doing it. But yeah, the love of the game. I love that. So Mike, thank you so much for being with us today. I know our listeners got a lot out of the conversation. My name is Andy Temte. Find all things that we're doing at andrewtemte.com. And you can find us on LinkedIn and also on Facebook. Mike, where can everybody find you?
I would go to trendingined.com is probably the easiest place to find. And then on LinkedIn, I'm active and available, so you can find me on LinkedIn. Michael P. Palmer, I think, is where you'll find me, but also you can go to Palmer Media on LinkedIn as well. I'm there looking for conversations.
All right. Well, subscribe to the Balancing Act podcast on your favorite podcast service. Subscribe to Trending in Education on your favorite podcast service. I'm Andy Temte, and have a great rest of your day.